Well, good morning, Citylight. My name is Joe, and I serve as one of the pastors here. If you have not already, go ahead and get your Bibles and turn them on or open them up, whatever it is you do, and go to 1 Kings chapter 19. That's where we're going to be at this morning as we continue our series in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. And as you're turning there, I want to launch us this morning and kick us off with a question. Have you ever felt exhausted? Has that been a thing? I'm going to guess by the laughter that, yeah, maybe that has happened in this room once or twice. Have you ever felt discouraged? Have you ever maybe even fell into despair? Have you ever felt like God had abandoned you? Maybe you had an experience with God that was so real that you thought that you would be changed and walk closely with God for the rest of your life, and yet you found yourself yet again in a season of depression or despair, maybe even questioning God a very short time later after that season of fruitfulness. Well, for the last 2 weeks, we've seen God do amazing things in the life, in and through Elijah. Elijah was fed by ravens at a creek. He was provided for by an unlikely widow. He saw that same widow's son raised from the dead. And Elijah prayed, and it didn't rain for 3 years, which threw shade at Baal, who was the pagan god of storms. Then last week, we saw this amazing showdown at Mount Carmel, where it was Elijah pitted against 850 prophets of the idols Baal and Asherah. And God came through as Elijah literally called down fire from heaven. He exposed Baal as a phony man-made idea and then took those pagan prophets down to the creek for a little bit of a chat. And so it's been an incredible ride so far as we've jumped into the life of Elijah. But today, in the passage that Micah just read, we have a hard shift. We get a little bit of whiplash. This is literally days after that showdown at Mount Carmel where God came through and through Elijah, where Elijah faced those 850 prophets. And if you remember, Homeboy was walking around with some swag. He was making fun of the fake gods of these 850 prophets. And now Elijah today, again, days later, he's on the run for his life. Days after the confident Elijah stood strong in the face of fierce opposition, we see a weary and tired man that's ready to give up. And so I wonder this morning if you've ever been there. Maybe you thought you had victory over a certain sin and it came back with a vengeance. Maybe you started your marriage full of faith, but now you're ready to give up. Or maybe you've had seasons where you felt like God was speaking directly to you, loud and clear, but recently, it seems like things have just gotten quiet. Well, church, this is exactly where Elijah is at this morning with God. But what we're going to see in the story in our text, I hope is going to be an encouragement to us, because what we're going to see is Elijah at his lowest of lows. After probably his highest of highs, immediately followed up by his lowest of lows. And what we're going to see from God is not a God that pushes away from him. We're not going to see a God that shakes his head at Elisha, but we're going to see a God that enters into Elisha's life in the lowest of lows. He provides for him. He's going to speak to him. He's going to care for him. God is going to show Elijah that, yes, I am in the highest of highs, but he is also with us in our lowest of lows. So the title this morning is this, the sermon this morning is this: how to battle from the bottom. How to battle from the bottom. And as we walk through the story this morning, I'm going to have 3 points of application. Number 1, for us to acknowledge where we are at. Number 2, for us to acknowledge where God is at. And then lastly, to acknowledge God's voice. So let's go ahead and jump into our text. We're going to be in 1 Kings 19, 1-4. This is coming right off the heels of that showdown with the pagan prophets at Mount Carmel. Look with me at 1 Kings 19, verses 1-4. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." She's threatening him to kill him. Just a little bit of explanation there, that's free. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Okay, so after we've kind of been reading and going through this book, we all of a sudden have a hard stop. This is not expected. If we're reading through the book of 1 Kings, chapter 19 is not something that we are expecting. Elijah so far in this book has been the portrait of faith and strength. He's called simply the man of God in many other areas in the book, but now we see him running for his life. For the first time in this book, we get a picture of a scared and weak Elijah. So the first point this morning from the narrative is this: acknowledge where you're at. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not be okay. So if we can, let's just try to put ourselves in Elijah's shoes for a moment. Remember, he's a prophet of God. And as a prophet, he has a job. God has given him a job, and that's to call the nation of Israel, which is God's people, back to God. To call them away from pagan worship, from worshiping Baal in this case, the fake God, into worshiping the one true God, which is Yahweh. This is Elijah's main job description. This is what he is to do. Well, in doing this, Elijah has made himself some enemies, namely the king of Israel, Ahab, and his wife, Jezebel. Now, Ahab, the king of Israel, has secured a significant political victory in marrying Jezebel. Jezebel is a princess directly north of Israel, an area called Sidon. And in this marriage, they've actually found significant political and military strength. In fact, this marriage, this political alignment has actually led to the countries around them fearing them, not attacking them, and so it's actually led to some peace. And so Ahab has secured this by marrying Jezebel, but here's the thing, Jezebel has brought with her Baal worship. And not only that, she has killed nearly all the prophets of God in Israel. She has rid almost the entire nation of them. And so Jezebel hates Elijah because he is a prophet of God and because he directly opposes her and the fake God that she worships. It's in his job description. He has to do it. And Ahab hates Elijah because he threatens the geopolitical powers that Ahab has built with Jezebel. So his two main enemies are the very king and queen of Israel, Ahab and Jezebel. But on Mount Carmel, Elijah thinks that Baal and Jezebel have been dealt a death blow. Remember, all the prophets of Baal are there. Their God fails. Yahweh sends down the fire from heaven. All of Israel bows their knee to the one true God. Ahab is there. He sees this whole thing. Elijah's thinking, surely he's going to run back to Jezreel, which is where Jezebel was, and he's going to get rid of Baal worship, and Jezebel's going to take a hike. But, as we saw from the narrative, that's not what happens. We see that Ahab goes, and he tattletales on Elijah to Jezebel, and then Jezebel threatens to kill Elijah. Now, this is a legit threat because Jezebel has already done this before. She hasn't killed Elijah, but she has killed almost all the prophets that are there in Israel. So this is a legitimate threat. So Elijah, he just takes off. He's out of there. He's booking it. He goes about 130 miles and then some. So this is a long walk. But what we need to notice from this is we need to notice what is conspicuously absent in the text as Elijah runs away. What is absent is the word of God. It doesn't say that Elijah sought the word of the Lord to figure out what to do. It doesn't say that the word of the Lord came to Elijah and said to run. Elijah is doing this apart from the word of the Lord. He is acting on his own. So he runs away, far away, and sits under this tree, and look what he tells God. He says, "It is enough." On a day that he thought he was going to party, when his enemies went down, he is now sitting He has gone to the wilderness to die. He's tired, he's weary, he's scared, and he feels like he cannot go on. This man of God who has seen and done so much is done. And we can't miss this, church. Elijah, who had just had this amazing moment with God. How many of y'all have seen God rain down fire from heaven, right? Well, Elijah did, and yet now he's in complete despair. And so I just want to pause here. And I want this to sink in because I know that in many different ways, every single person in this room has been there somehow, somewhere. The depth might be different, but you've been there. You've been disappointed. You've been tired. You've been weary. You've despaired before. I know some of us in this room are there right now. You've raised your kids in a home centered around Jesus only to see them run away from him. You've worked hard to forgive an unfaithful spouse and to do the hard work of reconciling with them only to see it happen again. You fought so hard against an addiction only to see it creep back in. Or maybe you went through a season of fruitfulness where you saw God do amazing things through you, but recently it's just felt dry, and it's felt like there's been no fruit that's come from anything that God has done through you. Church, you have something in common with Elijah and something in common with each person in this room, and that's weakness. We are all weak. We all have fickle moments. We all want to give up, like Elijah does here. So if that's you this morning, I just want to encourage you. You are not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. That's not wrong with everyone else that you've ever met in your entire life. The questions that we ask in these moments, the dark thoughts that come in these moments are real, and you do not need to be ashamed of the thoughts that come in these times. And if I can, I just want to take a moment to get very real and very straight to the point here, because I think this text gives us an opportunity to talk about something that we don't talk about much. Unfortunately, we can't gloss over what Elijah is asking here. He wants to die. He's talking about suicide. Very simply, he is talking about suicide. So you don't think that maybe some dark thoughts are coming into his mind. I hope you guys see just the pit of despair that this man is in. And he's willing to say this and to bring this out. And this is why I want to point this out. And this is why I want to say those words, is because there is a lie out there. And this lie says that if someone is a Christian, they should be strong enough to not contemplate suicide. The lie sounds something like this: if you pray enough, if you read your Bible enough, if you are doing all the right things, you'll be strong enough to never go to this place of despair. But here's the deal. This is Elijah. This is like one of the men of God that the Bible holds up, and he is there. And so let me just say that narrative, that lie, that if you're a Christian, you're going to be strong enough to not go, there is a lie. And this lie isolates and shames those who do get to that place. There are people that get to that place, and that lie does nothing but push away and isolate our brothers and sisters that get there. And church, here's the thing. Among everyone in the world, we should be the safest place to bring up things like contemplating suicide. We should literally be the safest place where you can share your deepest, darkest, hardest thoughts that you've ever had. And here's why. Because we as Christians should be the first ones to recognize our weakness. We as Christians should be the first ones to recognize that there has gone something wrong in our heart, and there really is no depth that it cannot go to, and no depth that Jesus cannot bring us up out of. Amen? And so we should be the first to engage with and to comfort someone who is struggling with dark thoughts. And so don't buy into that lie that you are the only one, or that you can't ask the tough questions, or that you should be ashamed of the dark thoughts. These are common to us all as humans. They are common to us all as fallen people. So let's not be surprised by our weakness, church. And can we just give ourselves and others around us permission to not be okay? Is that all right? Can we do that? All right. Well, on the other side of this coin, we need to look and see where Elijah takes this despair. He's got despair. He's there. But in verse 4, we see that he cries out to God. He says, "O Lord, O Lord." He cries out to God. So we may certainly have extended periods of time in this place of despair, but let's not forget that we have a God that's much bigger than us. We need to acknowledge our weakness and our despair, but we cannot remain there because we've got a big God. You have to turn your attention to God if you're going to battle from the bottom. And so we have a little bit of a line to walk here as followers of Christ. It is okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to wallow there. It's not okay. It's okay to admit the fact that we struggle and we are not okay and be very vulnerable with where we are at exactly, but it's not okay to refuse to look up, to refuse to look to God, to bring our pain to Him, to bring our despair to Him. Sometimes we get in that pit of despair, and to be quite honest, we don't actually want out. We feel justified there. We feel like that's probably where we should be. If we're honest with ourselves, we're mad at God for us being there in the first place, and so we don't want to look to Him. We don't want to look to Him to lift our heads. But church, the best thing that we can do, the best thing that can happen in those low parts with our hearts is to trust God more than we did before. That's the thing with suffering. That's the thing with despair. It can actually show us our weakness in it's so much vivid light that we see our need for God all the more. That we see that we can trust God all the more because we've been at the lowest of low, and guess who was there? It was God. So when we find ourselves in this place, let's admit it. Let's not be ashamed of it. Let's invite others in, and most importantly, let's turn to God. So Elijah does this. He cries out to God, and then in the next verses, we see God's response to Elijah. So look with me at verses 5 to 8. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. So remember, Elijah is a prophet. He's got one job from God. And as he's running away, he's throwing that one job away. He's saying, "I'm done." He's leaving Israel. He's leaving the people that he's called to, and he's out of there. He's not doing literally the one thing that God has called him to do. But let's look at God. What does God do? Does he move on? Does he strike Elijah down? No. God moves towards Elijah. He tenderly provides for him in the place that Elijah is at. So the second point this morning is this: acknowledge where God's at. He will meet you at the bottom. He will meet you at the bottom. So here Elijah sits, asking to die under this tree, and it's time for us to peek into and to see the character of our God. God provides for Elijah. He goes there. Remember, God didn't tell him to go. Elijah went, but God went there to be with him. He sends an angel to minister to him, to provide for him. God feeds him twice here. And a couple of things are happening with the fact that God fed him twice. First, he's feeding him so he doesn't die, which is very practical. He said, "Guess what, Elijah? I know you want to die, but today is not the time. So here's some food. Get up, get strength. Let's go." Second, many biblical commentators believe that God is feeding him twice to show him a couple of things. The first one would be his past faithfulness, God's past faithfulness in the life of Elijah, as if to say, "Look, I've provided you every single time." And then the second time is as if to say, "Look, I'm going to continue to provide for you. I'm not done with you. I'm going to provide for all of your future journeys." And so, church, do you see the kindness of God here? You see, God does not need Elijah. He doesn't need him. He's not desperate for Elijah to get up so that his plan can continue. He is not anxiously awaiting to see what Elijah might do, yet he still moves toward Elijah. In the midst of the weakest point in the life of Elijah, God has compassion on him, and he provides for him. And so, church, our God is a compassionate God. When we wane, when we show weakness, he does not look on us exasperated, but looks on us with compassion. This is a very character trait of our God. In fact, Jesus said as much in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 to 29. It'll be up on the screens. Jesus says to this, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Church, what a cold drink of water for a dry and weary soul. You're weak. I'm weak. We're all weak. But God moving towards us means we don't have to focus on our weakness, but his strength, his provision, his character, his plan. In our weakness, we can trust in his strength. And guys, I can't tell you how many times I've seen God do this among us in this church, among this church family right here. People at the pit of despair crying out to God and seeing God be faithful to lift their heads. I've seen couples cry out to God after an addiction ravaged their marriage, or after an affair ravaged their marriage. They cried out in despair to God, "God, would you help us? Would you be our God?" And I've seen God provide and slowly bring them out of despair into reconciliation where they thought there were no bridges to get there before. I've seen young adults, after losing a job or failing out of medical school or their fiance breaking up with them, crying out to God, going to God, and God providing for them and slowly bringing them out of despair. This has been the same in my life too. About 12 years ago, out of nowhere, I started to deal with a very crippling anxiety. I started experiencing somewhat frequent panic attacks, and this was starting to happen around people all the time. And I love people. I'm somewhat extroverted, and I love being around people. But this anxiety and the panic attacks that were associated with it kept me away from people. I hated being around people. I hated going to church, which I loved. I couldn't even really go to a grocery store without experiencing at least some form of anxiety, and a lot of times a panic attack. And I remember many times literally crying out to God. And I would ask him, I would say, "God, would you just take this from me? I don't know what to do with this." But the prayer that really stuck in my heart, and I think the prayer that he really answered, is I said, "God, would you just be enough? Would you be enough? Would you provide for me? Would I find my worth in you, my value in you? Would I find everything I need in you? Would I not be worried about all this stuff that is happening that is maybe causing me anxiety? Would I not be caught up in my circumstances? But God, would I find my fulfillment in you?" And over time, over quite a bit of time, actually, he provided. Slowly, my confidence shifted from my circumstances to simply being in him. I was learning that I could trust him even in the midst of anxiety, even in the midst with all of this stuff going on. And then as that happened, the anxiety, which had a death grip, was slowly starting to loosen and give way. And the more I trusted in God, regardless of the circumstances, the more that anxiety started to loosen its grip. You see, church, when we are weak, God doesn't shake his head at us. He doesn't tell us, "Hey, I told you so." He welcomes us in. Tired, weary, anxious, he tells us to come to him, and we will find rest. We will find provision. We will find strength. So, church, let this be an encouragement for you this morning. If you are there with Elijah today, or if you have been there, or if in the future you will be there again, you guys are noticing a pattern here. Know that God is not waiting for you to get your act together. He's not going over every little decision you made before you found yourself in that place. He's not doing that. He's not waiting to see how you will respond. He is not shaking his head at your unfaithfulness. He is not sighing because you cannot carry the load anymore. He's providing for you. He's saying, come to me and find your rest. So, church, God does not want us to despair at our weakness, but to rejoice in his strength, and in turn, find our strength in his. Now, honestly, we could stop here, and this would already be good news. You guys would be super happy because it's only been 25 minutes. You'd be like, oh man, shortest sermon in Citylight history. This is amazing. We're out of here. We're weak, God's strong, and he'll provide for us. But God has more to show Elijah and us. And so let's move on and look at verses 8 to 12, and then 15 to 16. And he rose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. And he said, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rock before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And jump down to 15. And the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. So the context is very important here. Elijah is standing on Mount Horeb, and elsewhere in our Old Testament, this mountain is known as Mount Sinai. So this is where God came to Moses and showed himself to his people Israel the first time. And in that instance, when he was there, when he was displaying his power and his might, what was coming along with that was wind, earthquakes, and fire. So the three very things that we see happening here, that is what God's presence brought with him. Additionally, what did Elijah just see a little bit ago? Fire coming down from heaven from the presence of God. And so likely, Elijah is equating the presence of God with these big miracles, these big things. And yet God comes this time and he shows himself in a whisper, a barely audible sound, a slight breeze. What's happening here is God is showing Elijah that, yes, I am in the miracles. In fact, I can put on a big show, but I'm not limited to that. I'm in the whisper as well. I'm in the quiet as well. Sometimes it will seem like we can barely hear him, but that does not mean that he's not there, that he is not working. And so the third and final point this morning is this: acknowledge God's voice. He will speak through the silence in a whisper. So Elijah here's a little twisted up. He has a little bit of revisionist history. God asks him why he's there, and Elijah rattles off all the bad things that have happened, forgetting all the miracles that God had just done in his life. And I wonder if we can relate to that. When we're in that place of despair, all we're telling God is all the bad things that have happened, forgetting his prior faithfulness that he's shown in our lives. But God is gracious again, and he does two things for Elijah that are amazing. First, he shows him his presence, but again, in that low whisper. As if to say to Elijah, look, don't think that the evidence of my work and my presence is in the big show. Don't put me in that box. I am working in the big and the small. I'm working in the major and in the minor. Second, he shows Elijah that the mission is not finished. God is still working and moving. What does he tell Elijah to go? He says, nope, go back north, go that way, and you're going to anoint this king, and you're going to anoint Elisha to follow you up as a prophet. God is saying, my work is not done, Elijah. You see, the symbolism here on this mountain is significant. This is the same mountain where God made the covenant with his people Israel. He sent down the law, the provisions, the rules for living an abundant life in God through Moses. Send those down. Now Elijah is scaling that same mountain, and he's coming to tell God, hey, listen, your people got a failing grade. You did a good job. The law was great, but I'm just saying your people are too weak. They got a failing grade. You gave it your best shot, God, but I'm sorry. We lost. But thankfully, God shows Elijah that he was not in fact done. He did not lose, but he had actually been working this whole time. He tells Elijah that he, being Elijah, will go and play a part in preparing the way for what God is doing next. He's going to prepare the way for a new king. He's going to prepare the way for a new prophet. He's going to prepare the way for the work that God is going to continue to do in the nation of Israel. You see, church, God is showing Elijah here that his plan has not been knocked off track. He had not thrown his best at Baal and Jezebel and lost, but in fact has been working in ways that Elijah and you and me can never imagine. And this is important, church, because we need to be reminded that God still speaks and works in this way. The same God that radically saved you, that spoke to you at that retreat in college is the one that is with you as you wipe up spilled milk, deal with exhaustion and postpartum depression. That's the same God. You need to know that the same God that moved in your heart so powerfully is the same God that is with you while you're grinding it out at a job that does not inspire you. It's the same God. God is speaking to you and using you in loud and quiet ways, just the same. The importance of God's voice is in the voice itself and not in the decibel level. The power of God's voice is in God himself and not how loudly he speaks. And so for Elijah, what that meant for him was that this amazing prophet, this man of God, the best thing that he could do is participate in the bigger plan that God had for him. And for him, what that meant is that he's going to pave the way for the next generation of people to do God's work. Now, again, honestly, we're going to see in the rest of the series, things don't get a whole lot better for Israel either through this, but what we will see in this series is that God is there. He is always there, always working, sometimes in the miracle, but a lot of times in the whisper. So somewhere around 900 years after this, God would use another prophet to pave the way for his work. God would come into this world as a whisper to two nobody parents in a nowhere town. And later, a prophet by the name of John the Baptist would proclaim the coming of this whisper to be Jesus, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And through that whisper, through Jesus Christ, God defeated death, sin, and Satan forever. Do you see that? Through working through a whisper, God orchestrated the most significant thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. And so soon, for us, there's going to be the loudest trumpet sound the world has ever heard, signaling the completion of what started in Genesis, continued through Elisha to Jesus, and through us today. And church, this is what I hope we see from today. You are human, and you are weak. I'm sorry to share the bad news with you. But as a human, you also bear the image of your Creator. You are an image bearer of your Creator. And that Creator is working for the good of his creation at all times, which is why he sent his Son, Jesus Christ, that through faith in him, we might inherit all of the good that God has in store for his people. Let this passage today show you your weakness. Let it show you that fear, anxiety, exhaustion, coming to the end of your rope, this is all a part of that weakness. But church, would we not despair? Would we not remain in that place focusing on our weakness but on his strength? Would we be comforted knowing that God is always at work, even when we don't hear it, even when we don't see it, even when we can't feel it? God is working through the shout and through the whisper. Additionally, would this change the way that we treat one another when we are in the place that we saw Elijah in today? Would we not shame people when they have dark thoughts? Would we not be afraid to bring the hard questions to God? Would we, like our God, have compassion with each other when we're at the end of our rope, when we're exhausted, when we are done? And lastly today, if you've been here and you've never experienced that hope, if you've been in that place of despair and not had the hope on the other end, if you've felt the exhaustion without the confidence that there is something more, that there is something better, if you have felt your failure and not the hope of a Savior, let me just point you back to the passage I quoted earlier from Matthew, which Jesus says this, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Before the lightened load, Jesus says, come to him. Come to him. All of the promises of God find their fulfillment in Jesus. Come to Jesus today. Surrender your life to him. Find your rest in him. If he is whispering to you this morning, don't ignore him. Come to him.